This is a conversation that we have been waiting to have for, I think, about 5 years. Ever since Hans, out of the blue, still don't know, like the daring of this stranger wrote to me and said, come to BasedCon and let's have talks about fantasy and sci-fi and Tolkien and history. And he showed up at my house, at my home, and drove me over there. I mean, I don't know. It's like, strange men show up from Michigan and offer to drive you to stranger men to talk about sci-fi and stories. And that was 5 years ago. And Hans has been very generously driving me on a regular basis to and from BasedCon, during which road trips we have great conversations. And so I am happy to be here tonight for the road trip version of the Aetherczar. Welcome to the Mosaic Arc. So here we are. Here we are. No slides, just raw Rachel and Hans. I mean, no, seriously, it's like we can't we should have done this from the beginning, right? We keep trying to do these like formal professorial doctor things, and no, it's Rachel and Hans tonight. Tell me some stories. What have you been
Well, what
working on? How have you been? I really like that you have like matched your lighting to ours now so that you can be cool with us.
well, I have to up my game, Rachel.
I always. Well, I mean I mean, literally, I was thinking about, we've known each other for a long time now. It's been very fun. But that seriously, you wrote to me out of the blue and said, come to this conference. I was just like, okay, I'll come talk about Tolkien and the Ring. And I'm prepping to teach my Tolkien course again this spring. So it's all these things come back around. It always comes back around.
Well, one thing that I've certainly discovered in my career in tech is we don't get a lot of discussion of humanities. So if
Mm.
I want to indulge my interest in history and philosophy and related subjects, I need to reach out and find some other people to talk with. So I've appreciated the opportunity to discuss all those things with you, because I think there are some very important and generally overlooked aspects of the history that underlies science that is very important to understanding science, and in particular where science went wrong.
So I'm your house historian. Okay, that's good. Let's do it. So you've been writing a bit of history, which I hope that you recognize that if I decided to start doing antenna science and came to you with my Heathkit and was declaring that I challenged the entire structure of your profession, you might be a little skeptical.
Well, I don't think I'm challenging the
See how he
historical
dodges. See how he
perspective.
dodges.
I'm too busy challenging the physical
Oh, fine.
perspective.
Okay. Well, all right. In any case, you're right. I agree. And what's funny is I recognize, here's the problem, right? So you're saying the scientists don't know enough history, and so we need to get them thinking about the way in which the development of knowledge has affected the way in which we see our explanations of the physical world. Is that fair? Is a
That's a fair
Okay.
assessment.
Yeah, but we're always sort of half, it's like we're like the cartoon dog that's sort of, really built up in one arm and really weak in the other or something. We have one, it's like I have the history practice and you have the science knowledge, and we try to bring the two of them together in a uh, strengthening way, and yet I mean, it is really challenging because I've been trying to suggest to you various things to read over the years, which I realized I now I don't remember whether I threw Innis at you or whether you found that on your own, and then we had to how do you say not correlate, calibrate.
Mhm. Well, I came across Innis 25 years ago, so
Well, you are
that
in communications after all, so that's fair. So that's actually good. It's like you've had the communications tech in us, and I had the McLuhan mystical experience of
right.
media thing, and we're
Yeah.
finally bringing the two together. This is great.
Well,
Okay.
I hadn't even heard. Well, I had heard of McLuhan and the medium is the message and a few
Mm.
other little cultural catchphrases, but I really didn't get all that familiar with McLuhan until you started pushing him on all of us. And I'm still far more into Innis than I am into McLuhan, just because I find Innis's approach very. It's very interesting how he's come up with his classification of different kinds of media, and it's very relevant to some of the issues in science that I'm wrestling with.
Well, this is great. So we did, Casey and I did an episode a few weeks ago that was the robots and just sort of introducing Innes. But you need to introduce your Innes, because I came to reading him. I mean, I guess the way a lot of people did, because McLuhan was very fond of his work, and it was, to a certain extent McLuhan's fame that pointed people to Innes. But as true Innes fans, like, Innes was there first, or at least the thing is, actually, no. I think it's they McLuhan was already working on his problems of education and the trivium, and his thinking about advertising and message and symbolism before he ended up in Toronto within us. So they converged. So we're converging now. So you need to give us your Innes, your story of Innes.
Well, let me back up a bit and set the context for people who aren't familiar with my big fields and energy project. About oh goodness, 15 years ago or so now, I realized that everyone had been doing electromagnetism wrong for the last century. And I was pretty convinced I'd figured out how it worked. And I wrote papers and I spoke at conferences and I got kind of tepid approval from a lot of audiences, but I was not able to really break through and get people to pay attention to what I was doing. I even managed to get a paper published in the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society, so a top tier peer reviewed journal, and it was still crickets. So that's when I realized I needed to step back and rethink my approach.
So wait,
And
I do this to you. I interrupt you. What do you mean crickets? Right? That they were just like, nah, it's not that interesting, or they were like, no, you're crazy. I mean, did they
I
not
didn't
get it, or is it that they didn't understand why you were so excited, or they rejected it outright?
they didn't get it. They
Okay.
didn't understand the big picture. And I can understand why, because I was talking to professionals, people who, like me, had made a career of taking Maxwell's equations and successfully applying them in a whole host of antenna and related kinds of problems. And for someone to say, your baby is ugly, your initial reaction is, what do you mean my baby is ugly? I've had this baby for a while and I'm very proud of it and I do all kinds of great things. And I mean, people have a lot of difficulty stepping outside of their box and taking a critical look at the fundamental premises that they've been taking for granted. And when you ask them to start questioning them, there's an awful lot of intellectual inertia that has to be overcome.
Okay,
And I was,
that makes sense. So, that they're saying the baby's ugly, but the baby talks. I mean, it's like so are they unable to hear you because whatever they're they may misunderstand we may misunderstand the premises behind why it works, but it works anyway, right? There's sort of a like we could be wrong about why electromagnetism has the properties that it does, but still make machines that seem to make use of it.
oh, it works, but what I'm proposing in electromagnetism is that there is a very simple physical picture that explains how it works. The notion that fields guide energy. The conventional wisdom is electromagnetism is due to one entity called a photon. And that
Mm.
entity, the photon, combines the mutually contradictory properties of being a localized particle and a non localized wave at the same time. And as I studied how electromagnetism works and how electromagnetic energy flow works, I realized that fields and energy were doing different things. They were moving in different ways through electromagnetic systems. And I became convinced that electromagnetism wasn't one thing with two mutually contradictory paradoxical properties. Instead, electromagnetism was two things. It was fields doing their thing, interacting, having constructive and destructive interferences, and them serving to guide the flow of energy as it does its thing, taking its own independent path.
Okay,
And that,
okay. But the people at your conferences who make antennae and do other cool things with electromagnetism, does your insight change whether or not they can make the machines that they do?
well, we all agree on Maxwell's equations. And since I'm using Maxwell's equations and they're using Maxwell's equations, the things they do with Maxwell's equations are perfectly valid. What I'm offering is first an intuition of a physical picture of how it works. Feynman, for instance, said that if you want to condense the greatest amount of scientific knowledge in the fewest amount of words, you would say all things are made of atoms. And once you have that physical picture in mind and think through the logical consequences and implications of all things are made of atoms, all of a sudden a whole swath of chemistry and chemical reactions and the ratios of things reacting with each other, it all begins to make sense, much more so than if you tried to approach it from an ad hoc basis. So that's the kind of, fields guide energy is that kind of a very simple picture that helps explain the equations that everyone has been using. And there
So
are a
it helps
couple,
it helps you see things that you couldn't see otherwise if you understand
right? It makes it much
differently.
easier to understand and it resolves some physical problems that have, really confounded people for over a century that they're still wrestling with today.
Okay. All right.
So that that
That's
was
my
my
big so what question. Right? It's like if we have I mean the thing is we can play this game with like, I don't know, geocentric versus heliocentric or something. It's like what does changing your model of
right.
structure help you see that you couldn't see otherwise? If in fact, I mean, it's like for most of us, except for the astronauts, knowing it's geocentric or heliocentric makes zero difference, right? You still do all sorts of other things that either model could support.
Exactly. And in
Yeah.
fact, you'll find people are still using the geocentric model today. I mean, if you want to talk about uh, celestial navigation and satellite orbits,
Hmm.
people are basically assuming that the Earth is stationary and the satellites are moving around the Earth, and it's only when you're getting into small corrections to that basic picture that you start worrying about, oh, the sun is moving and the Earth is moving around the sun, and so forth.
Okay, so what you're gonna talk us through is why knowing about fields and energy, what new vision it gives us. That's our big goal here. Yeah.
Um, if that's the way you would like to take it,
Well, I mean, that's what I've always wanted to understand. So, but the thing is,
okay.
that and I want to understand why Innis is exciting to you too. Is because he's helping you unpack some of your rhetorical difficulties of helping people see why the fields and energy model is true,
Well,
or
really,
simply better?
he's convinced me. He basically gave me the ideas I needed to understand what I was already doing implicitly.
Got it. Okay.
And what that is physics has become unanchored in time. It has
Mm,
become space based. And we'll talk about what that means in from Innis's framework in a minute.
okay.
And what I have been trying to do in my Fields and Energy project is anchor it back in time. So that's Innis gave me that understanding of what was behind what I was already doing implicitly. But let me step back just a moment and explain what I mean by this Fields and Energy project, because it all got kicked off thanks to a mutual friend of ours, science fiction grandmaster John C. Wright, because I was in Washington, D.C. I had just pitched some ideas to DARPA. I was very frustrated that the people at DARPA didn't seem to be able to understand what I was talking about.
What is
And
DARPA?
DARPA is the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. So I was
Okay.
there trying to share some ideas and convince them to fund them, and I completely struck out. So I was just describing how my day went to John and to his wife Jaji, and they asked me, "So what is this Fields and Energy idea you have?" And I explained it to them, and 15 minutes or less, they got it. And that was when I realized that it wasn't that I was dealing with something that was so complicated, only very well trained, brilliant physicists and engineers are going to be able to pick it up. The basic ideas are really pretty basic and pretty simple. My problem was those blinders, those prejudices that people have, where they're unwilling to step back and question premises that they've taken for granted, that they learned from their professors, that have worked successfully through their entire careers. Why would you call all that into doubt just because someone has this crazy idea they're trying to sell you about fields and energy doing different things in your systems?
Right.
So
So,
that's when
but
I
I mean
realized.
that the thing is the Maxwell's equations have worked. So there's yeah, okay. There's also the level of explanation that I'm wrestling with my ability to explain mythology and prayer and transcendence and things like that with historians who tend to think in terms of markets and political systems and parliament. And
Mm,
I for those who have been following our longer conversations, the Mosaic Arc, like when we talked with James last week about the East India Company, I'm suddenly like, oh, I was starting to feel like where this explanation fits in with the kinds of explanations that the field has been working at, the intellectual field has been working with for some time. And
right.
if you're talking at odds with like if it's the kinds of questions that the field can ask and give satisfying answers to, and you're trying to work outside of that, nobody can hear you. It's
Right.
it like they simply they just look at you and just say either, I mean, what they say tend to say to me is, oh, that's not history. And I'm like, but you said you wanted to empathize with other people's worldviews. And they're like, yeah, but not like that. Or that they can't see where their own worldview is constraining their expectation of reality. So when you're talking about things that don't fit in that model, it's fairies and elves. It just doesn't
Oh,
it just
and
doesn't
and
fit.
and you would think physicists, being scientists, would be immune to that sort of thing from their rational, dispassionate height of studying the fundamental features of nature. But it's fascinating when you go in and look at the history of modern physics. The conventional narrative that we are told is that classical physicists believed, I guess it was Laplace who said if you knew where every particle was and what its velocity was and what forces were acting on it, in principle, you could know everything would be completely determined and you could know the future course of events in the universe.
Everybody always just wants to tell the future. That is literally the main goal that people have.
Yeah. Well,
It's why
then
I'll never
along
make enough. I'll never be rich because I refuse to try to tell the future.
Well, then along came quantum mechanics, and it forced physicists to abandon their cherished idea of classical certainty and causality. And that story is just complete nonsense, and it's a reversal of cause and effect. Because if you take a look at what physicists themselves were saying even before those quantum mechanical discoveries were made, they were already throwing causality under the bus, or under the, I guess at the time it would be under the streetcar wheels in Berlin, and they were philosophically primed to interpret the discoveries of atomic physics in terms of that acausal probabilistic perspective.
Mm.
And even when a very brilliant young French physicist named Louis de Broglie pointed out that we could explain these things with a concept he called pilot waves, the idea that there were waves that moved through a quantum mechanical system that guided the motion of the particles through it. It makes sense. When I came across it, I thought this makes so much more sense than the probabilistic acausal observer makes the wave function collapse approach that was taken by Niels Bohr and his Copenhagen school. But sadly, that's the approach that ended up prevailing. And in the 1950s, there was another physicist named David Bohm who rediscovered de Broglie's pilot wave approach. Sadly, Bohm had communist sympathies and ended up having to flee the country to Brazil. So he wasn't able to stay and defend his ideas. But his colleagues at Princeton, one of them in particular, J. Robert Oppenheimer, who of course you're familiar with as the director of the Manhattan Project, he became the director of the Institute for Advanced Studies at Princeton. And there are all kinds of stories told about his reaction to Bohm, because he did not like this idea of having a clear picture of quantum mechanics, because that was in defiance of what Bohr had proven back in the 1920s and 30s. So the story goes, he handed a graduate student Bohm's paper and said, "Don't come back until you've proven this wrong and found a flaw in it." And after a few weeks, the graduate student came back sheepishly and said, "I'm sorry, Dr. Oppenheimer, I can't find anything wrong with this." So Oppenheimer takes the paper back with a sigh and says, "Okay, I'll do it myself." And he goes through it and he can't find anything wrong. So finally, he convenes a seminar with all the physicists and the grad students and the postdocs there, and they spend all day going through the paper, discussing how they can prove it wrong and what the flaws are with it. And at the end of the day, still nothing. They haven't been able to find a logical flaw with it. And according to one of the participants, Oppenheimer said, "Well, if we can't prove Bohm wrong, we'll just have to agree to ignore him." And that is exactly what happened. And one of the problems is, and this is a good example of oral versus written communication.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, this is a story that's passed down, second or third hand from, supposedly someone who was there to their students, and so forth. And I'd have been kind of skeptical too if I weren't a firsthand eyewitness to something very, very similar.
Right.
Because when I was in graduate school, I had a gentleman named John Wheeler on my graduate committee. And John Wheeler was the professor at Princeton who hired Bohm in the first place. He studied, I didn't know that at the time, but he studied under Bohr. He worked with Bohr. He was committed to Bohr's consciousness first view of quantum mechanics. In fact, he coined the term "it from bit," arguing information is more important than reality.
Mm.
So
the consciousness part is that our observation determines states. Is that
right?
Okay.
The tree does not fall until you hear it or see it. Basically,
okay.
The cat is
the
alive
joke,
and
right?
dead.
The joke that the Schrodinger's cat was supposed to make ridiculous.
Exactly,
right,
was taken
exactly literally. Taken as like, oh, the cat's both. Okay.
So one day I went in to talk with Professor Wheeler about this because I had just discovered the pilot wave approach, and I was so excited because finally quantum mechanics was making sense. So I asked Professor Wheeler, "What do you think of this pilot wave approach to quantum mechanics?" And he scoffed and said, "Oh, the screwdriver theory of quantum mechanics." And I didn't quite get why he was so dismissive of it. So I said, "Well, is there some place you've you've written down, or paper you've written, or someplace I can go to learn more about why you don't like this pilot wave approach?" And he looked away a moment, then he looked back at me and he said, "You know, I really ought to look into that someday so that I can tell where it went wrong." And that was exactly the attitude that so many, that Wheeler and Oppenheimer and so many of their contemporaries had, that it had to be wrong because they were all deeply committed to Bohr's approach. And the Nobel Prize winning particle physicist Murray Gell-Mann commented that Niels Bohr brainwashed a generation of theorists, and I really think that's the case. The blinders were on, and no one was willing to give a serious hearing or look at the pilot wave approach to quantum mechanics. And what I found when I finished my explorations of how electromagnetism works was I found the exact same picture. I found classically fields behaving like pilot waves, guiding the flow of energy that in the quantum limit would look like particles. So basically what I've shown is that the pilot wave approach to quantum mechanics, which is dismissed as an arbitrary way to save causality for the reactionary physicists unable to grasp the deep and profound wisdom of the Copenhagen interpretation. Instead, it's deeply rooted in the behavior of classical physics and classical electromagnetism. So what I've been doing in
the oral versus written part of the argument here is interesting. It's like there's a truth that people can speak socially and one-on-one and sort of in a oral environment, and then there's the things that we can prove when we sit down to write the paper out. And I think, I mean, one of the things, this is, I'll just, translating for all of those of you who are not physicists, although all of our friends are here. So Raymond's here. Raymond, thanks for the thumbs up. Thank you. Well, no one rid me of this turbulent theory. Exactly. Yeah. And Fat's here, and John Abrisi, and there's a few others, but they're staying quiet and listening. So we have a heavy tech presence tonight, but for those of you who haven't, there's certain things that you can prove in a discipline that like work well with the arguments that people have made. So, for example, so I'm reading this book on elves and fairies because I'm going to be thinking about Tolkien, and it's talking about stories in the 19th century about changelings, and like when people thought that their baby or their loved one had somehow been switched out by a fairy and it was sick, right? And in the post, the Whig Enlightenment political economy theory of things, the reason that they're convinced that these people or babies have been changed by the fairies is, they're economically impoverished and they're socially, backward or peasant-like, and they're putting the babies in the fire to break out the elf and get their own baby back, but they're basically burning up their disabled children or something. This is apparently in Ireland. And you can look at that and you say, well, of course the changeling argument is idiotic because there aren't such thing as fairies, and the reality, the truth is this supernatural version of things, which is ignorance and poverty. And the way to cure people of that is, of course, remove the ignorance and uplift people economically. But it leaves us hanging with the metaphysical question of like everything else. And in history, that's where we've pretty much ended up. There's the only things we can explain are economics, and everything's explained economically. We're all Marxist, basically. It's all economic. Political decisions are based on economic factors. Social structures are affected and created by economic factors. And there's no why to anything, right? Well, and so ironically, the history has become sort of mechanistic in that way. And you're saying physics is, with quantum theory, become anti-mechanistic with its sort of a consciousness probability. It's weird. We've like switched places as knowledge realms. Yeah.
Well, two observations. First, I don't think it was necessarily a matter of social status or wealth, because you'll recall Arthur Conan Doyle got all caught up with the teenage girls who took the pictures of the fairies in Cottingley and was convinced that the photographs the girls took were of real, honest to goodness fairies. And
Because they were photographs. Yeah. No, that's actually in the book. I'm going to get that. It's going to get to that. This is a new book,
okay.
a new book, apparently. It's published by Yale, and I forget the name of the author.
Mhm.
It's translated from German. But no, specifically the changelings problem is the, like what your example shows is this desire for a transcendent or metaphysical reality in our efforts to explain the physical can work in a lot of different ways, right? That Doyle is trying to convince him that the girls, was, one of my friends did a really great paper on this. The girls are showing that they drew these little pictures, right? And that it's like, here I am with the fairies, right? So it's like tourist photos. And what Doyle and his fellow fairy enthusiasts wanted to think was it was scientific proof, when it was a social thing, not a scientific thing, as far as the girls were concerned.
Well, this kind of circles us back to Innis, because written documentation is the hallmark of good scholarship.
Right.
It has to be in writing. And I mean, my first exposure to the fact that really wasn't true was when I was writing my ultra wideband antenna book. And one of my professors was fond of saying that if you want a good match, a good impedance match to an ultra wideband antenna, you should start with a well-matched antenna. His wisdom was basically, don't try to take a piece of junk that doesn't work at all. Try to get something that works reasonably well to begin with, and use all these clever matching engineering techniques to take something that's okay and turn it into something that works really well. And I had a whole bunch of his books and papers. He never communicated that in writing. I certainly heard him
right.
say
A lot of our wisdom is craft. It's
right.
apprenticeship communication. Most of what we do as historians is like, this is, I'll say my jokes about, like, I couldn't build an antenna, like, unless you've been through that craft training. There's all sorts of things that we have not explained anywhere in writing in the field.
Right.
For people to understand how we test evidence. And I mean, sometimes, like, David Hackett Fisher did write a good book on historical fallacies, but it's weirdly difficult to explain to someone why reading this text and putting together these various pieces of evidence and testing the way a narrative goes together, you can tell whether it's true or not. And it's like, and I can say that's one of the reasons that I get, freaked out and frustrated with stuff online. I'm like, that can't be true. But could I step you through why I know that? It's interesting how difficult that can be.
Well, I mean, there's a lot of fundamental concepts in physics that we take for granted that were communicated orally, where, like, there are a number of characters. Feynman is one. Another is Ernst Rutherford. I mean, Rutherford had all kinds of clever quips. If you can't explain it to a barmaid, you don't really understand it. Or all science is either physics or stamp collecting.
Yeah, these are sort of Zen like, they're sort of Cohen like, right? It's like you want to have that flash of understanding, which the thing is, once you've had that flash of understanding, you really do know it. But now how are you going to, this is like the poetry problem, right? How do you get people from A to B? There's this leap, there's this flash of an intuition that puts the ideas together. And once you've seen it, you can't unsee it. But how do I get you there? If I don't know how I got there, because it suddenly, so I don't know whether I've used this example with you before, but Dorothy Sayers, in her first mystery novel, has Peter, Lord Peter, reflecting on all the evidence that he has. And she has this wonderful paragraph where she talks about how he's assembled all the evidence, and then it suddenly goes whoosh, right? And he suddenly sees all of it together. It's all there, complete. And the metaphor she gives is, it's as if you had these letters, and it's lots of S's and a C and an O and an R, and suddenly you can just rearrange it and you see what it spells. But it's that kind of flip of intuition, which I'd say is probably why John and Jaji were so capable of doing what you were trying to do, because they're used to that in storytelling. It's in fact, what you're doing is very, very difficult for people who are thinking in terms of engineering problems rather than in collecting evidence together, having it like gel, and then it's there.
And that's why I adopted the approach in the Fields and Energy Project of writing up my theory in a form. I don't know. I'm aiming for a really smart high school student. That might be
Mm.
a little optimistic, but at least an undergraduate, someone who has an interest in physics and electromagnetism and how it works, ought to be able to pick up my book and read it. And a lot of it is just going through the fundamental philosophy and the history and the concepts behind how we know science, how we came to discover science. And
So you get
yeah.
Tyler is here too. Woot! Awesome seeing these two greats live streaming together. We have a fan club. Um, so explain. Now you've been writing this history book that keeps popping into like multiple volumes, right? How it's flourishing itself. I don't know. Popping is the right metaphor. Branching, right? It's this
Well, I mean,
great tree of knowledge that you're
I
cultivating.
had one book, and I knew I was kind of pushing the page limit. You know, you go over 550 pages, Amazon will not allow you to self-publish it
It
as a
gets hard to
hardcover.
bind if it gets too big.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So I knew I was pushing the limit, but I had my draft, and I figured I'd start putting it out on Substack. And I got to chapter 5, and there was this 3-page section on relativity. And I made the mistake of opening the hood and investigating Albert Einstein and his career.
Yeah, this is my life, not Albert Einstein, right? But you open the hood and suddenly you're down a yet another rabbit trail.
Oh
Yeah.
yeah, there is so much stuff that uh, people are generally unaware of. A lot of stuff that has been discovered since I did my undergraduate and graduate physical training. There, a lot of the details of the relationship with his ex-wife and the mystery illegitimate daughter they had, who I had no idea any of this stuff had happened, let alone Einstein's affairs and all the politicking that was taking place behind the scenes and the
They never put
anti-relativity
this
people.
stuff in the kids book version.
Yeah, it doesn't show up there. You get the here's a brilliant man who discovered relativity. Do not look further,
Yes.
because if you do, you discover your heroes have some very sizable shoes of clay that they're tromping around in. Anyway, that ended up expanding into about 120 pages, and I realized I, and I realized that the book that I figured was probably going to have to be split into two was going to end up a trilogy. And that actually works out very well from the content, because book one is Fundamentals and Origins of Electromagnetism. And I take a historical survey of physics in general, electromagnetism in particular, up to just about the end of the 19th century. And I explain a little bit about how modern day physics has fixated on this model of electromagnetism that I call the model of a single charge radiating. And it goes back to J.J. Thomson, his discovery of the electron, everyone just fascinated about how the electron's the fundamental particle behind electromagnetism. So they start trying to look at electromagnetism as an electron wiggling around, and out pops a photon from it.
Mm.
And that view got reified and amplified by Richard Feynman in his Feynman diagrams. Now, Feynman was working on a problem called quantum electrodynamics, where all the solutions were these very elaborate power series. And he came up with this notion of using these diagrams to keep track of the different terms and the physical meaning of the terms in the power series. They aren't depictions of reality, but a lot of times physicists, whether implicitly or explicitly, are treating them like that.
Mm.
So even today, physicists think that, or if you ask them, back them into a corner and get them beyond the shut up and calculate mode of thinking, the picture they're thinking of is, oh, that charge wiggles and out pops a photon from the charge.
Mm.
But if you want to understand that, you really need to go to Zen Buddhism. And one of the famous Zen masters asked his students to contemplate what is the sound of a single hand clapping? And of course, the answer to that is that's nonsensical, because clapping requires two hands.
Right.
And if you try to understand clapping through the lens or the perspective of looking at what a single hand is doing, you're going to end up in paradox and confusion. And that's exactly what physicists have done, because the concept of the radiation from a single charge wiggling or accelerating, that makes no more sense than the sound of applause from a single hand clapping. You need two charges in order to get radiation. And if you try to adhere to that single charge radiating model, you get all kinds of paradoxes. Like there's, people like to ask me, well, you're proposing this new theory and you're saying that the way we've been doing electromagnetism is all wrong. Well, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and you need to have an experiment that proves that your view is right and the conventional wisdom is wrong. So I thought about that, and I came up with the perfect experiment that in fact, we can do this experiment right now, live on the live stream, along with everyone watching wherever they are.
Experiment right now.
We're going to do an experiment
right now. Okay.
Here's what I'd like you to do. I want you to hold your hand out as steady as you can. You're not allowed to, you have to be very careful. Don't move it. Now, slowly start into motion until it hits whatever nearby object you have, the table, the microphone, whatever. Okay. Now, observe carefully. The moment you started your hand moving, did all the atoms and molecules start racing faster and faster and faster until they hit that object at close to the speed of light, triggering a chain reaction that leaves the Earth a glowing, exploding ball of plasma? I didn't see that result.
Nope.
But that is the result.
Maybe it
predicted.
did.
That is the result that the conventional wisdom and the single charge radiating theory predicts. It's a well-known problem.
You got to back up on this, right? So in the theory, it's like if you move something, it's like this is the Zeno's paradox kind of problem. Like, can I hit it, right? And what just in the sense of it's nonsense, but you can logically sort of set yourself up to believe it, and then until you realize that wait, no, that doesn't work at all.
Well,
but what's the exploding universe?
It's a problem called the problem of radiation reaction. And if you adopt that single charge radiating perspective, then you start to move the charges in the atoms and molecules of your hand. And a photon pops out because you're accelerating those charges. If you take a look at the fields of the photon, they're arranged in such a way that they will cause more acceleration, which means you get more radiation and more acceleration and more radiation. You get an exponential runaway increasing acceleration until everything's moving at the speed of light and you're setting up shock waves and the Earth is an expanding ball of plasma.
Because you moved your hand?
Exactly.
Okay, we're talking wizards.
That is the logical consequence of this problem. It's called radiation reaction, and you can look it up.
Clearly, if we can harness it, we've got. I'm rereading Harry Potter right now, and we just need a wand and a zapper, and then.
Well, I don't think you'd want to be anywhere where that theory actually was correct, because things go bad very, very quickly.
Okay, so what you're saying is we can't channel this. This is not energy that we can use in zapping.
No, you don't. Like I said, you don't want to be anywhere near a reality where the conventional wisdom of a single charge radiating, spitting out a photon works, because things go bad very quickly.
Okay, so this is right. I don't think you've told me that part before. And you have just demonstrated that their entire description is nonsense, like that.
Yes, like that. What really happens is an accelerating charge doesn't emit energy, it absorbs energy. If you think about it, that accelerating charge is moving faster and faster. Its kinetic energy is increasing, and that energy is being absorbed from its surroundings. Or you can look at an accelerating charge as a little current. And as it accelerates, that current is getting bigger and bigger. It has more and more and more magnetic field energy because of that increasing current. accelerating charges absorb energy. If you take a look at
Okay,
the
but
big picture,
doesn't that mean that I should be able to do like this and it goes dark?
only if you only under certain circumstances. It'd be tricky to set up a situation like that, because what happens is it's only in the neighborhood of the field that's causing that acceleration that the accelerating charge is absorbing energy. And then toward the, say, the edge of the field, the fringing fields of the capacitor that is doing that acceleration, that's where the radiation fields are picking up the energy to radiate away. So physicists are oversimplifying it, assuming that they can reduce it to a single charge and a single photon, and ignoring the larger system of the field that is causing that single charge to radiate, and the device that's supporting that field, and the other charges that are set up to create that field.
Okay, so Raymond is saying ultraviolet catastrophe got nothing on radiation reaction.
They're pretty similar, actually. You end up with the same end result of everything just being destroyed in a massive burst of energy. So they do.
I just, Doctor Strange. I mean, aren't we just like tapping into the magical thinking that people are desiring?
Right.
Okay.
Well, and that's, yeah. People come up with all kinds of complicated theoretical, additional forces that have to be there to counteract the radiation reaction, so that you don't get this runaway occurring, because clearly it's a non-physical phenomenon. But the fundamental solution to the problem is a single charge doesn't emit a photon. You have to take a look at the big picture of the broader system that's causing that acceleration to see where the energy is coming from.
Okie dokie. Okay, so we're still working towards why Innis helps you explain all this.
Well, Innis helps me in the first volume of my book is on the fundamentals and origins of electromagnetism, and the ending point I make is running through the single charge radiating model and what's wrong with it, just to kind of give a little teaser to tide people through the second book. And the second volume of the trilogy is where physics went wrong, and that's where I talk about modern physics.
The Middle Ages. Okay, we're done.
Well, the Middle Ages come into it because I decided I didn't want to.
Didn't listen to the Franciscans. Come on, we're done now. If you just kept with Franciscan thinking about creation, we'd be better off already.
I talked about the Franciscans and the Dominicans back in the first book, about how experimental science came about with Albertus Magnus and Aquinas, and the Dominicans. And
see, what I have, the place where everything's gone wrong. This is my current working problem of what happened in the Industrial Revolution and why everything's gone like diabolical. And Pope Benedict XVI said this in the lecture that he gave at the Collège des Bernardins in September 2008, which is Europe is founded on the monastic tradition, which is work and prayer, right? That it was the singing that supported the work and the work that supported the singing, and you need both of them together. And the reason that all of our work has gone diabolical is it's not from what I say now is it's not paired with prayer, right? So if our science had been paired with prayer all along and, stuck with the singing of the Psalms and the praise of our Creator, we'd all be better off. He's speechless.
No. You've jumped several steps ahead of my narrative.
Oh, so this is what I do, right? And this is the problems. Like getting from your scientific step to mine, we need prayer. Think how many steps we have to use to get people to that side. I've got my gemstone, right? We got to get to the gemstone here.
Well, what I did when I easily 80, maybe even 90% of book 2 is already serialized there on my Substack. But I realized I didn't want to just jump into Einstein and modern physics. I needed to have a little short introductory chapter. And I figured if I'm going to talk about where physics went wrong or where science went wrong in general, I needed to put the baseline down of what is proper science so that you can see this is the way it should be, and then here's how it went wrong in the 20th century.
Done in praise of the creator.
Well, patience, Rachel, I'm getting there.
I'm just helping people know where we're aiming.
Well, you can trace the birth of science back to ancient Greece and to the discovery that reality can be described through a rational, coherent narrative, a logos that describes how reality works. And the Greeks were the first to take a look at reality and how it works through the lens of logos, through the lens of there must be a rational explanation, and reality unfolds in a rational manner that is accessible to us as rational beings. And
created by God.
Well, that was not their perspective. They thought it arose from the nature of the cosmos. This is one case of Heraclitus, like 500 years before Christ. So that
cosmos literally means beauty. It's order.
The interesting thing is that you can trace it. Are you familiar with Philo of Alexandria?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, then, he came up with the idea of the logos as a Jewish philosopher studying in Alexandria in the 1st century AD. And
significantly, it's only the Christian tradition that preserves his writing.
Oh, I wasn't aware of that, but that's
it's the early Christians that like Philo.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, they like him because he anticipated the whole concept of the logos that you'll find later in the Gospel of John, and in particular, there's this one section I read, and I can see the argument. I'm not quite sure I have fully understood and am convinced that this is the case, but there's a case where he talks about the logos actually being the Son of God. Now, he's clearly not treating it like, in the incarnate sense that Christians would.
It's the Creator
has
wisdom,
an active principle
like a
that is related to it in the same sense that a son is related to its father. So effectively, what Christians did was take that logos concept and make it a core tenet of the Christian faith, recognizing that as being a active, co-equal property of the Creator.
Okay.
So what we find, one of the ways that physics has gone wrong is it's lost logos. It's lost the conviction that reality is rational and understandable, and instead is convinced, many physicists are convinced that it's irrational, that it's acausal, that it's only probabilistic. So that's one of the aspects in which physics has gone wrong. And I wanted to lay that out and make the historical case for that, because there's this alternate history conviction that the Greeks came up with science, and if it weren't for the Christian fanatics who crushed their early scientific wisdom, in fact, Carl Sagan in one of his episodes of Cosmos commented, if only the Greek Ionian tradition hadn't been crushed, even now we might have starships returning from surveying the nearest stars and the first colonists going out to stars in their starships with Greek lettering on them.
Yeah, he's an idiot.
Well, the part of the problem with that is, the Greeks, it was fascinating reading Polybius, because he had just this devastating account of what went wrong in Greece. And I did a post a few weeks ago where I related his story. And what he pointed out was that, in the wake of Alexander's conquests, the Greeks became fat and happy and prosperous, and stopped striving. They stopped having children, They ended up being hollowed out and weakened and easy prey to be picked off by the Romans. And
Polybius says this.
yes, yeah,
Well, he is trying to explain why they lost.
right. Well, they obviously lost.
Right, they did lose.
He came up.
Corinth is captured the same year Carthage is destroyed. So
Right.
the Romans are busy taking over the sea.
And they gave Corinth pretty much not quite the Carthage treatment. I don't think they salted the
No, but
the
they
earth,
destroyed it. Yeah,
but they destroyed it.
It's that's both of those are Rome taking over the shipping lanes. I wonder who else does that. Okay, never mind. Different topic.
Well, but Polybius, in his analysis and explanation of why Rome was able to do that, alighted on his theory of anacyclosis. His theory was that you start off with the primeval chaos and anarchy, and a strong man imposes order on it and takes charge as a leader, and that is the development of a monarchy. In Polybius's view, his descendants don't live up to his standards. They become corrupt and venal. They become tyrants, and they are overthrown by the best and wisest men of and richest men of the nation, and that embarks on a rule by aristocracy and oligarchy. That gives you aristocracy, the rule of the wise, of the aristocrats, and then they devolve in turn into a corrupt, venal oligarchy, which is overthrown by a popular revolution, giving rise to democracy, which in turn decays into demagoguery, where it's the rhetoricians and people who are bribing and corrupt who end up calling the shots and buying the votes, whereupon you end up back at anarchy and repeat the cycle all over again with a new monarch.
Okay,
And
you know what I say? Okay, are you going to say that this is wise or problematic?
It is
seductive.
It is a correct observation, I think, of a lot of Greek history. I think it's a little bit contrived, and he's making it a little simpler than it really is. But it's an interesting picture, and in fact, it's the motivation the founding fathers had.
Uh-oh.
Well, he pointed out that Rome had great political strength because instead of being one of those forms of government, it had a balance of powers. It had, the tribunes who were representing the people, and had a democratic element, the senators who were aristocratic, and then the consuls who had the executive power and behaved like kings. And the founding fathers liked that wisdom. A number of them, particularly I think John Adams, and I forget, there were a couple others who really liked Polybius and quoted him extensively. That was the balance of powers that they tried to create in the United States, the United States Constitution.
That would take us on another topic. Anyway, let's see. We've got some comments from the chat. John says, have you read Lee Smolin's The Trouble with Physics? He says, no society has ever operated properly without art, science, and religion. I don't know Lee Smolin.
I have his book. I have not read it yet.
Okay,
so I can't really.
We will we'll put a pin in that one. Raymond says, oh, Carl. And John says, yes, Sagan was an idiot. Ha! Just like Hawking, who said the universe was created out of nothing and then tried to redefine nothing to get himself out of the hole he dug for himself. It's Hawking who's digging holes. Polybius is basically doing the same thing that I said is very, very dangerous and everybody always wants to do. He's trying to predict the future.
Mm-hmm.
Beware. We're going to have a lesson tonight. It's like there are ways in which we can understand human behavior, but this temptation to know the cycles, I think Polybius is very, very dangerous in that sense, because it seems it's so comforting to think, oh, we're here, we're on, you are here, right? We're in this part of the cycle. That's those Greeks. Anyway.
Well, and that basically gave rise to another observation that you can have logos and the right philosophy and be approaching science the right way, but if you're doing it in a society that is politically and economically unstable, it's not. You're going to face a lot of problems, and it's unlikely you're going to have a scientific revolution or significant scientific progress when the invaders are looting and pillaging and burning your cities at the same time. You need political stability, and you have to have enough economic success to have enough surplus to support that kind of scientific work.
Okay, so this is now where you've trod into my territory, and we end up in the danger of periodizations, and the sort of back projection explanations of why various things happened. In our staff meeting this week in Euro history, European civilization, my colleague Ada was presenting on the Renaissance, and the problem with the Renaissance is it's this magic bag out of which you could pull anything that you need to prove that now we're at modernity.
Right.
That argument about like why the scientific revolution happens now is it's like Polybius's it's the opposite of Polybius's doing the why we got conquered argument. It's like why are we now in 1688 or 1776 or whenever you want to go now, why are we so powerful now? And it's a self-justifying description of inevitability, like we've got all the right pieces in place, and so therefore we are now in the flourishing moment. I am just as allergic to that kind of argument as well. It's like periodizations come out of back projections of nostalgia. And as we just said with Einstein, right? Einstein was not always cooked up to be, for lots of reasons that you've investigated very interestingly. It's the retrospective desire to find the cause that makes us elevate these particular figures and say, well, there's the genius that got us to where we are. And we almost never make our historical explanations correctly. That's why we have historiography. We keep changing them. It's like which part of the everything that was going on built up to the moment that we're in now.
Well, and it's important to keep in mind that these are factors. It will make it easier or more difficult to have successful scientific practice. But
this is what, if you're doing it as history, this is my big sort of flashing cautionary tale. It's like we're in the world we are in now, right? Your guys, the engineers that make stuff that glow at us and help us talk, and that we're having this conversation on. It's like there's a craft work and a skill in the practices, and we can see how skills develop, and that you, like your example from your teacher saying take a badly working one and make a better one. Like that's basically the history of technology, right? And it's fascinating how over however long human beings have been doing this, we keep coming up with I'm studying things like medieval textiles right now, and they will blow your mind if you've never looked at how do they make these little threads? How do they wind gold wire around these fabrics, so these little bitty threads, so they can weave these ecclesiastical vestments? Like you would not expect anybody to be able to make something like that 500 years ago. Like we're always falling into the trap of not appreciating how skills develop, and then claiming that they're historically it turns into this, why does this moment of genius happen in this particular historical moment? It's like you're asking the wrong question.
Well, I think you can take a look at the example of what happened in the past and figure out what some of the influences or causes may have been, realizing that it's not absolutely determinative that those causes inevitably lead to the end result, but they can be, they are influences.
You're not listening to me.
No, I
the danger zone has been entered of historical explanation, which is interesting, because it's like when you ended up down the rabbit hole, for example, looking at Einstein and exactly how his genius was actively promoted. It was an exercise of propaganda on the part of people that brought him on speaking tours in the United States.
Right.
That what we see is individual people making very skilled lifelong practices out of understanding things, and it's sort of mystifying why that's it. Sorry, I lost my thread scolding you. So I don't know where I am. It's a danger. The thing is, my field falls into this kind of thing all the time. Just as you're frustrated with your field, although my field hasn't been doing great man stories for a long time because they got suspicious of them. But
Right,
now, then they flipped over to the other side, and they do nothing but economic systems arguments, which don't work either.
right, right.
Yeah. So it's just as your field has gotten trapped by certain kinds of explanations that it defaults to because it's the ones they know, so does
Hmm.
history writing. It's sort of the certain kinds of narratives work, like Polybius's stages and stuff like that. Oh, well, that, it's a nice framework that helps you explain stuff, but then you realize it's explained nothing. It's actually not dug you down. Oh, and that the way I like figuring stuff out, how things work, is more like what John and Jaji do writing novels, right? You have a character, he makes certain kinds of decisions, you put him in his context of the other characters, that they make decisions, they gain skills over time, and they have these particular insights. That kind of storytelling is very dense and slow. And when people give, sort of grand mythological accounts of, the arc of history, they don't like to do it at that level. They get impatient.
Well, I understand what you're saying, but I think that's prone to lead to ignoring cause and effect relationships that do exist in history.
No, it's not. It's
Well,
it's it's
let me
it's
give you
the
let me
the
give you an
worry
example.
is okay. Just the worry I have is at some level we're reifying what actually happened into a meaningful thing. It's like indeed in the 17th century, a bunch of guys, particularly in England, managed to figure out a lot of technical stuff about observing nature. But if you describe it as scientific revolution and now we can do real science, that it gives it a different character of
Mhm.
what the event was. And then you start explaining, flashing, photons as opposed to a bunch of guys in 17th century England because the English are gaining a lot of great wealth. And so they have access to, processes and technologies and patronage and blah, blah. It's like
Mhm.
you can layer descriptions down to why these guys in this moment were able to do all this work. But yeah, anyway.
Well, one of the factors that is important to do good science is to be able to do experiments, to go hands-on, to build devices, instruments that allow you to take a look at what's going on, gather data in ways that go beyond the limits of our ordinary senses, and be able to analyze that and then theorize what might be going on to give rise to those experimental measurements.
Right.
But
Basically, the microscope and the telescope.
exactly. But if
Yeah.
you go back to the origins of science and to Plato and Aristotle alike, uh, you know craftsmanship was low class. If you were a mechanic, if you worked with your hands, you were a degraded individual who was below the level of philosophers. Plato,
Gee, I wonder who elevated work to a dignified human activity.
yeah, that is one element of that.
Oh, and you're going to say it out loud.
We'll get there. You keep jumping ahead because first I was going to talk about
I'm a
how
photon. Keep.
I was going to talk about the great engineer of the classical era, Archimedes, who I was very disappointed to learn probably did not run naked through the streets of Syracuse yelling "Eureka!"
I
and
saw it in the Indiana Jones movie. Come on.
and he probably did not build massive mirrors to set Roman ships on fire. But what he did,
No,
believe it or not,
no. Okay,
that
now I'm
that's a later
devastated. I'm
that's a later
devastated.
medieval addition, and Plutarch describes the siege of Syracuse, and you would think with all the detail he has of the military battle of was a Marcellus who was leading the Roman army,
Hmm.
he probably wouldn't have overlooked the in addition to picking up our ships and dropping them, and in addition to having all these machines that slaughtered our soldiers every time they came near the walls, he also set the ships on fire. Plutarch doesn't mention that part of it
No
uh,
flaming ships.
at all. No flaming
We're doomed.
ships.
Okay, so the chat's warming up now.
But the
Casey says impatience seems to be a good explanation for why people embrace easy theories of history and science. People always look for shortcuts.
oh, that's
Yeah.
quite so.
And Raymond says people want to have a simple answers or conclusions to stories tied up in a neat bow. Answers are not always simple and compact.
But
They're involved in narrative.
even Archimedes regarded his, you know, obviously very practical and superb engineering work. He regarded it as being beneath a true philosopher. He refused to write down what he did because it was sordid and ugly. And his contemporaries, like
The
Plutarch,
record keeping was sordid and ugly, or what he did was sordid and ugly?
what he did was sordid and ugly. He was taking the beautiful principles of geometry that allow us to access the harmonies and structure of the universe and become better people, and applying them to practical ends, which is sordid and beneath the dignity of a true philosopher.
Clearly does not understand the incarnation of the logos.
Correct. In fact, some of the earliest experimental physics was done in Alexandria in the 5th and 6th century by it was John Philopanos, something like that, who studied Aristotle, critiqued Aristotle, and even did the experiment of carrying the two different weights up to the top of the tower and demonstrating that they fell at the same rate, full millennia or so before Galileo was said to
Galileo was just good at propaganda. He's like Einstein.
So yes, having a religious and philosophic mindset where your God becomes incarnate as a carpenter really dignifies the value of labor, which was dismissed in the classical philosophic tradition.
And then having whole institutions, monasteries, founded on the philosophical principles of self-examination and practice and such, but that dignify labor by having you do it. So not just having your slaves do it, or so all of that book copying that we still haven't gotten to Innis. All of the manuscript book copying as a labor, and also, I mean, the Benedictines and the Franciscans are important because they are sons of craftsmen in a long tradition now that has dignified actual human labor. So yeah, the Greeks were snobs.
Yes, exactly. Although it's interesting how much
don't be a snob.
It's interesting how much they managed to accomplish despite that. And the Library of Alexandria was one of the few, after the Plato's Academy and Aristotle's Lyceum, the Library of Alexandria actually had a number of very insightful cases of experimental science going on, measuring the circumference of the earth and doing pioneering work in geography and astronomy. Ptolemy's work was compiled there, an early steam engine and so forth. But what's interesting is how the institution itself of the library burned down, although there's a considerable controversy about whether it happened in
or whether
BC.
It didn't even happen. Roger Bagnall did a paper on that. It's like your mirror.
Yeah, I think the puzzle of the library, was that his paper?
I can't remember, but the problem is we can't figure it. It's one of the. It's like Archimedes' mirrors. You think it's real, and then you realize it's papyrus. The papyrus doesn't survive. Parchment does.
Right. Yeah. Which gets us back to Innis.
Finally.
Because one of the things that scientific culture requires is the ability to record and transmit that information. And in the classical era, of course, people had papyrus. It was cheap, it was fast, but of course the issue is it didn't survive very many scrollings and unscrollings. And after the Arab conquest, it got really difficult for the Christian world, the Eastern Empire and Western Europe, to be able to acquire papyrus. So they had to switch to parchment, which has the advantage of being much more durable, but of course is more expensive. You're basically taking animal skins and turning them into your writing
which
media.
is supported by monasteries
Yes.
because they have sheep.
Well, they used calf skin too for vellum.
Yeah,
I
it's
guess sheep was
the
the
monastic
usual.
economy really. It's like it's rural, and it has all of the animal management, and they have big enough flocks that they can make those books. So in fact, I with your encouragement, I read Innis's Empires and Communication, and the one I've been flaunting around is The Bias of Communication. I'd say this one, if you guys want to start reading Innis, The Bias of Communication is probably easier going. But the Empires in Communication is his big historical survey. The argument that you just made about the papyrus and Muslims, that's Henri Perrin's Muhammad and Charlemagne argument. It also is important to know that for the past 100 years, that's been the major bone of contention in early medieval studies.
Oh, really? I wasn't
Yes.
aware of that.
It's like Perrin was right to. Henri Perrin was a Belgian historian. He first wrote a big history of Belgium, which had only really existed since 1830, when it was founded as a kingdom. So he's very interested in one of these backstory things, like where did we come from. He was also a great historian of the towns, right? He did trying to figure out why the Low Countries, Belgium in particular, was such a great urban region in from the from 11th, 12th, 13th centuries. The great trading towns of medieval Europe are the Low Countries and northern Italy. So you have the two poles on that trading route. He never actually finished his argument about Muhammad and Charlemagne. It was published from notes that he had made when he died, and his main argument was saying, it's like, why does European culture shift north from the Mediterranean when it does and how it does? Because he's worried about the history of Belgium, and he's worried about where that northern European culture comes from. And his argument was, it's when the Muslims come along and cut off all communication and trade and take over, and what had been the Christian Roman lake for a period now becomes a Muslim lake, and the Muslims are controlling all the trade. Alas, for that tidy argument, it doesn't work. And the major study that has been done to sort of prove that the trade carries on is Michael McCormick's The Origins of the European Economy. It's one of these giant books. It's like 900 pages. It's true that, the West really does fall, and there are true disruptions to the supply chains. The loss of North Africa and the loss of those grain ships is huge. You can't support Rome at the capacity that it had in the ancient period when you don't have the Egyptian grain ships and the North African grain ships. So that's a big deal. But the papyrus, the papal chancery uses papyrus into the 11th century, so it's not actually that. But Innis is actually and Innis, this is the problem for Innis, and this is why his stuff got buried and nobody really knows what to do with it. Is that was not this kind of long scale history was not his training or forte. He was, if you read, and that's why Empires of Communication is kind of so hard to read. He's basically compiling all his notes that he'd been reading from everybody else's histories,
Right.
and trying to put them all together into one big argument, which people had not done, so that was valuable. But he's heavily dependent on the scholarship of the regions that he's looking at, and if he's relying on Perrin for the paper and the papyrus and parchment argument, that's why people will maybe now not look at him and go, oh, he's brilliant, because they're aware of the challenges that have been made to the sources he was depending on.
Okay.
Yeah. Anyway, but the thing is, the parchment books were better because they're, as you said, they're more durable. They're easier to, a parchment book is a codex, and they can make them like this. And
Right.
their scrolls are actually very hard to read. It's like you unroll them. They were actually made by slaves for reading by slaves. They're more like audiobooks in the sense that you personally wouldn't sit around reading your scroll. Your slaves would read them to you. So they're like performance scripts, whereas the codex has and Innis does talk about this. The codex is actually really good for the kind of durable claims that Christian liturgy makes. and you need these kinds of books for doing the prayers of the liturgy, prayers again, that, and this, I think we need to get to your time argument and your time and space argument, that parchment, because it's a durable medium, can carry through time in a way that papyrus can't. Where there's papyrus, because it's a cheap medium, can control space, territory, space, but only briefly.
Right. Yeah, that's Innis's basic
That's
argument.
his basic, a huge insight. It's really good.
Yeah, he does a very nice job of tracing that argument through through history, and starting from the oral traditions of the Greeks. And I had not really appreciated that. Yes, the Greeks had writing, but it was kind of a backup to the oral tradition, and the oral tradition was primary.
Right, that
So
Aristotle didn't write anything. Those are all lecture notes. That's why his works are so variable in their polish.
right,
Yeah, because
right.
they're
Well,
not
that
actually
was
his in this, in the
you know,
sense that they're his from his teaching. But if you read something like the Politics or the Nicomachean Ethics, and you're like, this is sort of fragrant and it's scattered, it's because it's
right.
like it's reading his lecture notes, or
Oh,
it's reading
absolutely.
student accounts of what he said.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and the story of how some student took the notes and his grandchildren found the moth-eaten, water-damaged notes that great grandfather had taken and
Right.
sold them to a Roman. I mean, the Aristotle corpus was that close to being wiped out in classical times before it got in the hands of the Romans and they made lots of copies of it.
By their slaves.
Well, yeah.
It
But
matters. No, this was one of the really amazingly cool things I learned from Innis's description is saying, how did they publish in the first century, right? The golden age of Virgil and Ovid. It's you'd have a room full of slaves copying. Someone would read and they'd all, it's like to publish Horace's poetry, right? Someone would read it out and they'd all write it down.
mm-hmm.
Yeah. It's a big dictation room.
Right. But the point I was making about writing being a backup, it was kind of interesting. If you wanted to learn what Heraclitus had to say, you would have to go travel to Ephesus and hunt him down, and sit at his feet and listen to him lecture you on the logos and how people just don't understand, and how nature is difficult to understand. And he had a reputation. He was called the Riddler, or the Obscure, because he was very difficult to understand. However, it turns out he actually produced a manuscript of his writing that he deposited in a temple, and apparently Aristotle referenced it in writing his critiques of Heraclitus some almost 200 years later. But it was always a backup of the oral accounts, the same way that the original Hebrew scriptures were transmitted orally, but they had the written copy of the word stored in the Ark of the Covenant that the high priests could access, make sure the oral tradition wasn't getting too far afield from what was recorded in the ancient scrolls.
Okay, I feel less comfortable going into the Old Testament part of this argument, because I think there's pieces missing that I don't know yet.
Okay.
Yeah. But one, so the interesting, it's like partly because in the scriptures themselves, they say that Ezra wrote them all out again, probably from memory. And so whatever we have in the Old Testament, I think Kiltz and I did an episode on some of this ages and ages ago when we were talking about whether the Vatican has stolen all the scriptures, that the sense that where actually the Old Testament texts themselves come from, the Christians, because they use the codex rather than the scroll, which is what the Tanakh, the Torah, is in scrolls. The Christians using the codex make the book a visible thing in a way that it's like the gold bind them and carry them around at baptismal liturgies, read from, and then things like that. That the use of the parchment book does change the sense of the reality of those words. But even medieval books on parchment are all meant to be read out loud. They're marked for reading. They're liturgical props. They're not sit and read a novel. Yeah. Okay.
Well, and that was one thing.
The thing, the mindful of our time, um, the insight that you found useful in Innis's understanding of the time versus the space media.
Well, the insight that I found most useful was I realized part of the reason that I found it so worthwhile to explore these, the fundamental history of science and how it came to be, and what are the factors necessary to help science and to hinder science, and why it was that the Byzantines and the Arabs, they had all the Greek philosophers and the Greek wisdom. Why didn't they have science, and why didn't they develop it to the extent that eventually happened in the high medieval ages? And so I was exploring that, but I realized ultimately what I'm doing is taking the story of science in general, and more specifically physics and electromagnetism, and I'm re-anchoring it in time. It's become disconnected. The foundations have been forgotten. We're forgetting some of the fundamental principles that are necessary to do science. Principles like logos. There is a rational account
Mm-hmm.
that makes sense of what's going on in the universe, and that really needs to be re-anchored in time if we want to restore science.
Amen. Because I would say because it's a craft practice, and that's the skills. This is one of my big themes, that skills, you learn skills from you know engaging in the practices themselves. You cannot, and this I mean I've been working on this with my students this year because of the AI and the chatbots that can write their papers for them and stuff. It's like
Mm-hmm.
there are certain kinds of understanding that can only happen if you actually practice them. You can't
Right.
get them just from reading the book. Like literally, it's like writing is a very, very poor mechanism for even training you to write.
Well, I certainly
And
I certainly
I mean,
agree that you
reading,
have.
it's like you had everything that we have in our book, in the whatever media they have, they're all traces of actual practice, which is what my deep study is, understanding what prayer practice did, how it transforms the soul,
Right.
how it transforms the human being who participates in it. Those monks that are singing the Psalms all the time, they're the ones that came up with the great science. So how does their training themselves in their singing and their memory work and their praise of God? It's not just the idea that they carry in their mind of the Creator. It's all of this mental and physical discipline that they put into being what they are, which is singers. That the backstops the great developments that they have in the 12th, 13th, 14th, 15th centuries. It's like what I think what actually is behind the scientific revolution is hundreds of years of prayer,
Mm-hmm.
and that to understand the effects of that training on the soul and the mind, so that you end up, I mean, Descartes was trained by Jesuits, for goodness sake, and Luther was trained by Augustinian friars. That these people had the Psalms in their practice, they had them embodied in their experience, and just like you say, they're cutting off from time. They cut off their own expertise from the thing that gave it to them in the first place. It would be, for example, if the Olympic athletes, like the great skater that we're all paying attention to because he lost so gracefully, the Ilya suddenly just said, "Oh yeah, I was just born flipping." Right? It's like, no, I mean, and he's actually said this quite well in some of his interviews, saying, I'm here for, I understand discipline. I understand what it takes, decades of training my body to be able to do this.
Mm-hmm.
You don't do that because you saw it happen on a video.
Right. I think it is certainly true that you cannot learn an art or a craft without practice. However, you have the danger of running headlong into the tautology of, well, what is science? Science is that which scientists do. Well,
That's
what do
not what
they
I'm
do?
saying.
They do science. And, it's a circular
That's
definition.
yeah, but that's using science as one of these Newtonian abstractions like space.
Well, if you want, you do need to practice in order to learn the skill, but you ought to be able to you ought to be able to examine what you do and explain it and write it down in a way that will guide the young student who is, doing this practice to be able to follow what you've done. For you to throw your hands up and say, there's no way to learn it, you just have to do it, and the only way to learn it is do it. I mean, there are a
That's
lot of
not,
scientists.
it's absolutely not what I'm saying. And if that's where we are, this is a good place to have gotten, because we need to unpack this.
Sure.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely not what I'm saying. Science literally just means knowledge. Ciencia, it means knowledge.
Well,
And
originally it's expanded.
well,
I
no,
mean,
in the 13th century, what it means is knowledge. And what people like Roger Bacon and Robert Grosseteste and they're the main ones in the 13th century, who are doing various experiments and testing things and such. What they want is not scientia, they want knowledge, which they contrast with sapientia, wisdom.
right.
Scientia is what you get from studying creation, right? It's like you get knowledge about all these creatures and their properties. And so if what you're aiming at is knowledge, and you're doing it by, making paint, making pigment colors, or
Sure.
experimenting in architecture with, weights on masonry, or making gold thread for those amazing textiles and stuff. You're having to engage with the created physical world to understand its properties. So, I mean, it's saying you're doing science. Well, I mean, they don't do science. They pursue science. They pursue knowledge by way of working with the materials of creation. And the
Well,
materials of creation include their own minds, right? So that
well,
you're
I think
practicing it.
I think that there is a subtlety there you may be overlooking. It's not just pursuing knowledge, it's distinguished from knowledge by being exact and precise knowledge
Well,
of
that's because the
something.
exact and precise is what fails when, like your building falls down, or the color comes out wrong, or, so the thing is, I think what you're fighting, and I do appreciate this as a problem, right? It's like you're fighting the prestige claim of a particular kind of uh, social performance that in the
Right.
20th century was given status by way of the wizard claims that people who ought to have known better claimed, that, like Oppenheimer wanting to like make lasers zap, or like, I think, he wanted, whatever, the guy, the Cillian Murphy guy who, blows up the world. These guys, I mean, they're wanting magic power, and they try to claim it by way of this rhetorical trick of saying we're scientists. You're
Mhm.
you're wizards if you're playing that game. It's
Right.
like,
Well,
and
that
it's the
game is
same.
played a lot.
Right, and it's the same kind of game that I stand up against, saying, what people, history is this, laborious exercise of understanding, the skills that people, the skills including all sorts of things, institutional skills, social skills, family, like all of the wisdom that goes into being human, which we communicate to each other, you know, in various ways over our lifetimes. Um, if you want to turn that into now plebeian predictability, I beware, right? It's like the same
Yeah.
kind of, if you want to use science to predict stuff, now you're gambling.
Right. But
I didn't expect, I've clearly drunk enough wine to get feisty.
well, you had me at a disadvantage. If I'd known, I'd have gotten some whiskey or something to keep up
Don't
with
you have
you.
some by your desk? You come on, haven't you watched me enough on these streams? I have, these are
Oh, hold on.
okay.
I should
Yes,
be able to close strong now, but
excellent. Well, so Casey gets it. We are scientists, quote, we are scientists equals we are wizards equals we are Gnostics with secret knowledge, and you have to
yes.
trust us. That, right? And what you're describing, it's like you, Hans, are actually a genuine, like, you're pursuing of knowledge, right? But it's like you've made antennae that work. Cheers. Right. That this is why I pushed you at the beginning, saying, how does your model of what happens change what we're able to make, right?
Mhm.
Can you make better antennae based on your fields and energy model?
Well, I was able to. I
Oh,
had
Raymond
that
says
intuition.
skull. He says we're
I
getting down to the discussion.
I had that intuition as I was working in the area of designing ultra wideband antennas. Basically, an antenna stores electromagnetic energy in its immediate environment. And the reason antennas aren't ultra wideband and only work at particular frequencies is because of that stored energy. So by knowing where that energy was stored and how it was flowing, I was able to design shapes of antennas that would store less energy and would have more broadband characteristics. So that's one area. Another area is most wireless systems are working over distances that are many wavelengths apart compared to the wavelength of the particular radio waves, electromagnetic waves that you're using. But if you use very low frequencies and very long wavelengths, then the 1 over r squared rule everyone uses for those far field links breaks down. So I was able to use my knowledge of how energy is stored in the near field around antennas to develop the link laws to describe how two antennas couple to each other with very long frequencies in that near field region. So those are probably the two biggest areas of technology that I was able to pioneer and do some interesting work in by virtue of my understanding of electromagnetic energy and how it moves around. And having that practical experience, originally I wanted to be a professor like you and get to lecture the students and do research, but I'm realizing that was actually a bullet dodged, that I was not able to get into that position because my applied experience in industry gave me the practical hands-on understanding that I needed to be able to develop the theory. So really theory and practice went together. And
I
that's
think you
something
just proved what I just said.
Well, it's fascinating if you take a look at the books that students use to master advanced electromagnetism. Back in 1941, the book that everyone used, the physicists on the Manhattan Project, the electrical engineers building radars at the radiation lab at MIT, they all used Julius Adams Stratton's electromagnetic theory. And you can go to the table of contents and look at the practical topics that he covered on different kinds of antennas and their radiation, different kinds of propagation, waveguides, and a host of other practical applied topics. And you can compare that, and you fast forward 50 years to when I was in grad school. The book was J.D. Jackson's Classical Electrodynamics, which I think is still the most common graduate textbook. Well, you can compare, and you'll see that half of those applied topics are missing. In a very real sense, today's physicists have a much worse and much atrophied understanding of applied electromagnetism than did their predecessors of 80 years ago.
Yeah.
When I graduated with my PhD in theoretical physics, I thought, hey, I understand electromagnetism. I'm going to be able to go out and get a job doing practical things. It took me 5 years and a considerable amount of additional study before I landed my first professional job designing antennas, and really made me painfully aware of the shortcomings of theoretical physics when it comes to applying it to practical problems. But having that theoretical physics background helped inform and make me a much better engineer than someone who had just followed the classical engineering training.
So Raymond says, Jackson. Okay. Well, okay, so I'm at the University of Chicago, which it may or may not be the best place to be doing what I do, because there's the saying that they love has that's all very well in practice, but how does it work in theory? But the thing about the monastic tradition, just generically, in that I say that the medieval science, the monastic tradition needed good timekeeping because of the liturgical calendar. So they do a lot of the guys that end up having to the cantors particularly end up needing to set the schedule for the feasts and things like that, get really good at astronomy. because you're doing time, and then they make clocks and things because they need to be able to do their prayers on time. I also have this deep meditation that I'm developing right now. I hope I can explain it right, but on how late medieval practices of doing counted prayers like Ave Marias and a rosary, or I've got a book that I'm working on a review for. It has talking about prayers that include counted prayers that make embroidery mantles or coats or clothing for the Virgin Mary. And that's why I was looking at these books of these textiles, or these pictures of these textiles, because the prayer practices will include like 10,000 Ave Marias for the band of ornament or whatever on her coat. And I started thinking, wait, they're describing the thing they're doing, which is making these incredible embroideries or weavings or damasks, or all of this stuff that I think what's happened in the Industrial Revolution, one is you took the craft work away from the human beings who were training their hands to do it and put it in machines. Fast forward to now, when we have all this junk clothes that ends up in Africa because of all our donations, and then kills textile industries there. It's like, when the people aren't making the fabrics anymore, you've stolen more than just their livelihood. You've stolen their actual humanity, because you've stolen the practice that they needed, the skill they needed to make those fibers with their spinning and weaving and things like that, in all those beautiful fabrics, which these late medieval fabrics are mind-blowingly detailed. But I also think the obverse of it is the reason that the West was able to industrialize. I mean, Weber knew this, right? He calls it the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism, but he was a liar, because what he'd actually studied before he wrote that, the ascetic practices, were in the monastic tradition. He's claiming that the Catholics in his own region in the late 19th century weren't as industrious as the Protestants, but he knew that the practical industry of Europe developed out of the monasteries, and they're the guys who start on a clock and stop on a clock, because you've got to start your prayer at matins, and you have to wake up in the middle of the night, you have to start your prayer at dawn, and then stop and go do your other work, and then stop that and come back to your work. They're used to working on a clock, right? So this whole ascetic discipline of training yourself to be able to make things but do it in the monastic context, you're hopefully doing it with contemplation, which is what Aristotle said, right? The highest life is contemplation, but they twin these two together. If you cut off the prayer out of the work, you end up with Auschwitz. My students are writing their paper on this week. That we had to read Primo Levi's Survival in Auschwitz as part of our study of what happens in the 20th century. And the work camps were diabolical because they were obviously dehumanizing and degrading. Levi worked in the Farben factory, which never made anything because they never got the production going. But the Farben factory was one of these chemical companies that developed in the 19th century in Germany for making synthetic colors, dyes. Right. Again, another robbing of craft practice to make the paints and the dyes that they needed to make the beautiful textiles and the paintings of the pre-modern period. You had to have the kind of craft skill you just described needing to make your antennae.
But it wasn't so much that they eliminated those craft skills, it's just a different set of craft skills that you need to be a talented and skilled chemist, as opposed to taking your what is it, beetle shells and crushing
the cochineal. Yeah. Well, right, but I think so we need to, just as you're meditating on the significance of science now, understanding the effect of industrializing these craft techniques is now my current obsession, right? Because I think this is what Tolkien is also worried about. You see Saruman, it's Saruman versus the elves. Saruman industrializes their production. Galadriel, when she gives the gifts that she makes for the Fellowship, she said, well, we wove these cloaks, right? The cloaks that make them invisible and stuff. And they're made with the love of the materials that she put into them. And that the true craft work and love of the creation is what makes beautiful objects that the hobbits are, wonderfully comfortable and everything. They have water wheels and water mills
Right,
and
right.
things like that. But Saruman is the image of what industrialization has done to all of these craft techniques.
Well, and that's unfortunate because it's not the end of craft techniques, it's a change in craft techniques from the handmade craft to the enormous ingenuity and craft it takes to make those machines and design them and get them to work properly. And that is a whole art and craft in and of itself that you can take satisfaction from in engineering.
That's fair. You're still on Saruman's side, though, Jim. Well, and the thing is, this is what McLuhan and Innis help us think about,
Right.
right? And Innis's big backstory was he'd worked on staples in the Canadian economy. He was very interested in river transport, and he then got interested in railroads and the fishing industry, and
Oh,
then he
and
got
wood pulp.
and the wood pulp and the paper industry. This blew my mind.
That's what got him into media, I think.
That's what got him into media, because he started thinking about all, the trees that go and make the pulp, that go to make this industry of cheap paper, which drives the newspaper conversation, which is, in our version of things, it's, oh my gosh, the internet. The newspapers were just as alarming to people. John Stuart Mill was, famously frustrated with mass society, and it's mass society communicated through the newspapers.
Right. Well,
So
and that's the whole pulp fiction trend that is, all of
exactly.
a sudden you could have a bunch of people, the democratization of writing, where you could get a Howard or a Edgar Rice Burroughs, all of a sudden writing these frivolous stories
Mm.
that we still love today.
Right, and Innis was understanding the sort of physical supply effects of things like the papyrus and the parchment and then the paper, and then McLuhan had been thinking about the cognitive effects of training in grammar versus rhetoric versus logic, which is what he looked at in his dissertation in Cambridge in the 40s. And putting the two of them together, then you end up with McLuhan's sort of mystical, the media's extension of our ourselves into the environment, such, and that so what I'm arguing on the basis of the paint that's made with the bugs versus the paint that's made with petroleum. And McLuhan would sit there and say, yeah, so if you're surrounded by color that's made from bugs, you're surrounded by life. Whereas if you're surrounded by color that's made from petroleum, you're surrounded by minerals. It's something else. It's a different kind of reality that is in your environment. And that's what McLuhan is trying to get people to understand, that you are the medium is our environment that we create. The railroads or the roads or the shipping, the ships in the shipping lanes and all of those things. Yeah.
But again, I want to emphasize that all of those impersonal technological uh, developments that are decried, they are an art in and of themselves, and there is a beauty in making a machine that can crank out a vast quantity of nails and screws in quantities and at a speed that no human operator could match.
I don't disagree, but I still
No,
have to
I
give you
understand.
a hard time. Well, the thing is, actually, so what you need to do, I'll give you some homework then. Talk about that, right? Because the place where we're all obsessing right now in the Substack and Telegram world is on the AI,
Right.
but behind them are those machines that are doing it. And
Mm-hmm.
McLuhan and Innis would both have us be considering. People are worried about the water for the cooling of the data centers and stuff, but the data centers are, they're giant gemstones, because they're all of those precious minerals that they're putting together to make those big buildings full of
Well,
giant
but
gems.
the complexity is amazing, and it is an art every bit as spectacular as any Gothic cathedral to look at how those circuits are put together and how they're made in such miniature form. And talk about craftsmanship. the stereolithographic equipment they use to make chips is so difficult and so highly specialized. I think there's only one company in the Netherlands or Belgium, which might be an interesting way to tie back into your Low Countries argument. But there's only
I'm
one
loving
company,
it. Really?
there's only one company that has successfully mastered the craftsmanship essential to make the lithography equipment that can print on the smallest scales essential to make the most sophisticated computer chips.
Okay, A, you must find that out for me. And B, that makes so much sense because it's in the Low Countries where they do all of those wonderful prayer books, which have all the trompe l'oeil, like borders of like bugs that, Matisse, Matisse, he's one of the great Antwerp painters. And it's the guys in the late 15th century that like pay to fly and have people trying to brush it off the painting because it like looks so real. So it makes utter sense that it's the people in the Low Countries that develop that level of lithography, for sure.
Well, but it's not just in the Low Countries. I was suddenly surprised by being between jobs about 6 months ago. And as part of my job search, one of the jobs I looked at was a company that made particle accelerators. And they use these to implant ions in chips. And there again, they're the only company, the only people who had mastered that art. And they had lost their chief scientist and were looking for another chief scientist to step in. And I had to take a look at it and basically tell them that I kind of understood a large aspects of the theory that they were using, but it was very clear to me that there was an enormous amount of practice that the person whose shoes I would be filling had acquired over a career of working with this stuff, that I'd be playing catch up for the rest of my life and never quite able to really hit the ground running and make progress in that area. So
okay, you just proved my point again. Raymond says petroleum paints are former dinosaurs, according to some. No, they're not. It's minerals. ASM.
Oh, are we going to get into the abiotic theory of oil?
I believe that. The dinosaur thing I never believed that. It can't be dinosaurs.
I'm
even if it's minerals. I'm utterly, it's got to be just minerals coming up from the earth. That makes so much more sense. ASML and IMEC are at the forefront of advanced chip lithography in Belgium, driving innovation in semiconductor manufacturing. I am mind blown. It's like giant gemstones for the win, right? It's really good. Casey's saying the floor of Chartres Cathedral looks like a circuit board, and so the artistry is quite old. We have discovered. So Hans, you need to write what you just said about the beauty of those machines.
Well, it's.
I'm telling you, come on.
It's.
This is my gift to you from having come on the Ark. Homework.
It is a consistent theme that people are prone to the mind-body dichotomy. They will focus on one at the expense of focusing on the other. And in order to have insight, in order to make technological progress, you have to have both. You have to have theory and you have to have practice, and you have to be able to integrate them together. And if you try to go off and do one without the other, you're going to get off the rails somewhere down the road.
Then the word became flesh. Raymond says, the Belgian Research Institute, IMEC, in collaboration with ASML, opened a high NA EUV lithography lab in Veldhoven, the Netherlands, to accelerate the development of next-gen chip-making technology. Why didn't I know this? Okay, because I'm not in your field, but I thought the chips were in Taiwan. How is this?
Yes, they're made in Taiwan, but they're made in Taiwan using tools that are only available if you buy them from Belgium.
That is so mind-blowing.
Well, there are other examples.
The Belgians are keeping this really, it's like they're distracting us with all this nonsense that comes out of Brussels for the EU.
Well, just to you're familiar.
The Belgians are also great at comics. So.
You're familiar with Leonard Read's famous essay "I Pencil,"
Hmm.
that where he goes through and explains that even something as simple as a pencil, no one man knows how to make it. There are people. It is sourced from a couple dozen different uh,
Right, the graphite, the
materials: the
wood,
wood,
the
the lacquer,
rubber,
the
the
graphite, the
yeah.
rubber, and so forth. Well, a more modern example is the humble ballpoint pen.
Mm.
And I don't know if this has changed, but as of like maybe 10 years ago, China was the leader in manufacturing pens, as they are in most common consumer goods, but they still couldn't get the ball
Hmm.
of the ballpoint pen right. And their domestic balls that they tried to put in the pens just didn't work, and they had to buy them, I think, from another European company that was making the precision ball bearings that are essential to make a ballpoint pen work.
Okay, I'm just feeling happy because I'm right. Raymond says Aristotle and Plato have to learn to play nice together.
Well, yeah, that's another feature of the course of science, because you have Plato, who's consistently advocating the world of forms, the world of ideas, and treating that as being primary, and that true reality is just shadows on the wall in his cave. Where you have Aristotle insisting that you have to dwell in close association with reality in order to understand what's going on. And people who don't do that, who aren't intimately familiar with the facts of everyday experience, are prone to theorize and go off on weird tangents. He had a much more eloquent way of saying it than I'm paraphrasing. And sadly, even though Aristotle was a pioneer in observational science, particularly biology. He made lots of biological scientific observations that really were the last word in biological knowledge up into the 18th and even the 19th century. But without having that experimental basis, it really retarded mechanics and physics, just because of that prejudice against craftsmanship, and treating working with your hands as a disability that disqualified you from philosophic reasoning.
Yes, we need both the mind and
Right.
the words and the hands.
Right.
Well, this has been a great drive. We're almost there. You should pitch your stuff. So where can people go and find more from Hans, tying the time of science back, tying the roots of science back to its actual. I've lost my metaphor. Got to tie science back down to its roots. There you go.
Right. Well, you can go to my Substack, aetherczar.substack.com. I have weekly posts where I'm serializing my fields and energy books. Book one is available on Amazon, and I make a point of plugging it. Every post you'll see have you remembered to buy my book? Click here, so you can get it. You get it there. Most of the second book, Where Physics Went Wrong, has already been serialized. I'm finishing up what will be the introductory chapter to book two, and will be for another month or two. I just did my post on empire and communication. Next week's post should be interesting, because I'm doing a case study of Carthage and showing how Innis's how Carthage was the ultimate space-based media empire, and of course what went wrong with that. Kind of a cautionary tale of things not to do as you are planning out your society. And then I've been working on Christianity and science, and talking about the 19th century critics who argued, like Gibbons, that Christianity is what killed Rome and destroyed the pagan virtues, and the critics who argue that Augustine destroyed science for millennia through his thinking. And I go through and I explain the real story behind that, and examine some of the background of how the early Christians related to Greek philosophy, in particular, their attitude towards logos, and how they preserved and transmitted the idea of logos forward so that it would be available when the conditions were right to do science again.
I'm gonna keep fighting you on that.
I know.
Okay.
I didn't mean to bait you
Yeah,
like that.
just bye. Good night. Thanks for joining us. Thank you, Don. That was great. We'll have you back, and we'll continue the road trip discussion. Night, everyone.
Good night.